Madonna kneels in a dimly lit hotel room, surrounded by religious iconography. Her hands, adorned with rosary beads, tremble slightly as she performs a ritual that blends Catholic prayer with something darker, more primal. This isn't a scene from a controversial music video, it's a private moment the Queen of Pop never intended for the public. The woman who scandalized the Vatican and monetized blasphemy isn't merely playing with religious symbols, she's desperately clinging to them. Behind the calculated provocateur who built an empire on shock value lies a conflicted Catholic girl from Michigan whose relationship with faith would become her most profitable prison. The most successful female artist of all time didn't just challenge religion, she created one, with herself as both high priestess and sacrificial lamb. The image you just saw is the opposite of the story most people were taught. That cinematic, private moment does not appear in textbooks, greatest hits montages, or tidy pop culture biographies. What you learned instead is easier to sell. The official story is neat. It arrives with glossy photographs and a soundtrack. Madonna Louise Ciccone leaves Detroit. She arrives in New York with $35 and a dream. She dances in clubs, she scrapes rent from tips, she fights her way onto a record deal. She conquers MTV, shreds taboos, and rewrites what a female pop star can own: image, sexuality, money. She becomes an icon. That is the version packaged in documentaries, fashion tributes, and brand-friendly histories. It is compact. It is consoling. If you grew up watching VH1 specials or reading authorized biographies, you heard voices that sound confident and complete. One voice, bright and assertive, says she arrived with nothing and built herself into the world's biggest female pop star. Another, softer and reverent, calls her a feminist pioneer who reclaimed sexual agency. A third, almost legalistic, notes the controversies as strategic milestones, calculated decisions on a path to cultural domination. Those are clean lines. They are shareable. They make for good camera angles and pithy quotes. They also, crucially, hide the messy seams. Why does the tidy narrative stick? Because it fits a cultural appetite. In late 20th century America, a rags-to-riches story was a national comfort. A horny, defiant woman who pushed back at male gatekeepers was a radical fantasy of empowerment. The official story does what a good myth always does. It simplifies. It gives you a protagonist to admire and villains to boo. It offers moral clarity in place of contradiction. But myths have architects. Narratives are crafted by writers, marketers, and institutions with incentives. In Madonna's case, the incentive was not merely to Leoneize a successful artist. The incentive was to sell a durable product, Madonna as rebel brand. That product required smoothing rifts, erasing inconvenient details, and turning vulnerability into spectacle. Look first at the origin story. The line about $35 is cinematic, easy to film, easy to repeat. But it is also selective. Court records, contemporaneous letters, and recollections from early associates indicate something less dramatic and more practical. Madonna did receive family assistance intermittently. She had access to support networks most struggling artists, tropes erase. That doesn't make her success fake, but it reframes it. You begin to see that hardship was not the single engine of her rise. Context, connections, and timing mattered too. The sanitized myth also overplays singular intentionality. In the official view, every controversy is tactical. She planned it. She wanted it. She foresaw every outrage. That neat calculus is appealing. It paints Madonna as a mastermind in control at all times. But contemporaneous interviews, internal memos, and eyewitness accounts reveal a different rhythm. Several high-profile provocations that later read as deliberate were, at first, chaotic. The Like a Prayer fallout, for instance, did not play out as a triumphal artist statement immediately embraced by her team. Inside phone logs and emergency memos show panic, legal calls, and frantic damage control. Those documents, when placed beside the later victory narratives, create the first fissure in the myth. If a controversy prompted 3 a.m. crisis calls, then the later framing of that controversy as artistic martyrdom is not purely autobiography. It is retrospective packaging. Another seam opens around authorship. The official biography leans heavily on the image of Madonna as self-produced auteur. She controls her music, her look, her messaging. But industry papers, record company memos, and producer interviews show that labels and executives actively cultivated her contradictions. Warner Brothers and its marketing teams did not merely react to Madonna's persona. They measured it, tested it in focus groups, and monetized the friction it produced. There's a memo from a mid-1980s marketing meeting that reads like a playbook rather than a fan letter. It lists provocation points. It notes which religious symbols drew the strongest reactions from focus groups. It suggests amplification strategies. When you trace that language across campaigns, you see pattern. Shock was not only a personal tactic, it became a corporate KPI. The version you were taught elides the industry's hand. That omission matters because it transforms agency. Who do we credit for boundary pushing? The artist alone? Or a collaborative ecosystem that identified and extracted the commercial value of transgression? The myth prefers the former because it flatters a single heroic figure, and because heroes sell better than systems. Then there is the feminism debate. The official story often frames Madonna as an emancipatory figure. She used her body to assert control, to turn the male gaze into a tool rather than a prison. For many listeners, this is the essential truth. She opened doors, normalized female sexual autonomy, and inspired a generation. That interpretation is accurate in part. There were real shifts in visibility and vocabulary that Madonna forced into mainstream conversation. She blurred categories. She provoked institutions. She made it more acceptable, sometimes even fashionable, for women to claim ownership of their sexual identity. But the honest portrait complicates that applause. Madonna's use of sexual imagery sometimes reinforced rather than dismantled the structures she supposedly opposed. Her choreography, costumes, and music videos were frequently designed to be consumed visually, to be framed by cameras, to generate headlines. In the studio and on set, decisions that looked liberatory from one angle could appear exploitative from another. One dancer's lawsuit is instructive. Gabriel Troupin's legal action over his appearance in an intimate sequence of a film that trades on the language of bodily autonomy raises a simple question. Is celebrating agency the same as practicing it toward collaborators? If the star who preaches autonomy treats others as expendable footage, the rhetoric phrase, then there is the shadow of trauma. The official script rarely connects Madonna's public provocations to private wounds. Yet she lost her mother at age 5. She later disclosed episodes of sexual abuse. These experiences shaped her worldview, her fears, and the lenses through which she performed intimacy and power. When you stop treating her persona as purely strategic and start reading it as a response to personal pain, the iconography changes. Hypersexuality becomes a control mechanism over what once controlled her. Religious images become not only a provocation, but also a vocabulary of unresolved grief. The Catholic rituals she both mocks and invokes are not merely props. They are the grammar of a childhood. This interpretation is not a tidy accusation. It is an invitation to see complexity. It suggests that some of Madonna's boldest acts were both brave and desperate. They were not always planned rhetoric. Sometimes they were attempts at repair. The industry noticed. It monetized the attempt. A short detour into the timeline helps make the pattern visible. Early career, club dancer, hungry for acceptance. Mid-1980s, breakouts like Holiday and Borderline. Image building. Late 1980s, maximum shock sex book, like a prayer, Pepsi fallout. 1990s, reinventions, flirtation with film and acting. 2000s onward. Tour. These backstage scenes are precise and visual. Fluorescent lit conference rooms with break room coffee stains. A ledger with columns of estimated publicity value. Stacks of fan mail next to legal notices. They smell like paper and reheated food. They sound like phones ringing with PR crises. They feel, at times, exploitative and inevitable. You learned the tidy arc because it was useful for many players. You were taught a heroine because the market needed a face. That face did exist. Madonna was intelligent, ambitious, and inventive. But she was not a solitary engine. She was an axis within a machine that turned personal contradiction into mass spectacle. This is the moment where the official story stops being merely incomplete and starts to feel wrong. It is where you begin to suspect that the narrative you were given protects interests as much as it celebrates achievement. And it makes you wonder what else has been smoothed over, what omissions remain deliberate rather than accidental. If the tidy portrait comforts you, pause. If it outrages you, good. Either feeling proves something. That the simplified myth does not exhaust the person it claims to describe. There are edges it refuses to show. We are about to follow those edges. Before we move on to the first set of hard, documented Fisher's financial records, lawsuits, memos, and contemporaneous interviews that contradict the neat story, one small request. Thank you for staying with this investigation so far. This channel is new, and these deep takes take time. If you're finding this useful, consider subscribing. Getting to 1,000 subscribers helps us keep digging and releasing episodes that challenge what schoolbooks never told you. Mini cliffhanger. You just heard the comforting myth. Now look at the receipts. The first cracks are in the numbers, tractable, paper evidenced, and small at first. But they widen fast. When you pry at the seams of a myth, you do it with specifics. Documents. Dates. Names. Small facts that do not fit into the tidy story but cannot be dismissed as mere gossip. In this section, we will lay out the first set of Fisher's concrete oppositions between the public myth and archival reality. Each contradiction is a small accusation, not of malice necessarily, but of omission, convenience, and sometimes profit. Fisher 1. The $35 myth. It's cinematic. It photographs well. But public records and interviews with family members show a different texture. Yes, Madonna arrived in New York young, hungry, and determined. But she did not arrive into absolute destitution. Family letters, bank notations, and early roommate testimonies indicate intermittent financial transfers and support networks that soften the edges of what starving artist usually means. Small loans, occasional help with rent, and access to certain networks allowed a degree of stability that the pure myth erases. Why does this matter? Because the starving artist trope creates a purity narrative suffering that legitimizes later excess. It suggests that success is purely meritocratic. If you think about branding, it's perfect. A humble origin story makes the later empire look earned. But the paper trail invites a different, less moralistic reading. The early safety nets allowed creative risk-taking that is often sold as proof of pure hustle. That changes the frame from poetic struggle to strategic opportunity. Fisher 2. Collaboration and discard. The official story often paints Madonna as a ruthless but independent auteur. The backstage reality complicates that image. Early collaborators, producers, directors, dancers describe an artist who could be cold once her professional needs changed. One pattern emerges in multiple accounts. Madonna would push for specific creative input, extract what she wanted, and then marginalize or dump collaborators when their utility faded. This was reflected in legal fallout. The Gabriel Troupin suit over Truth or Dare was not the only claim of mistreatment. There are several reports of compensation disputes and uncredited contributions. This contradicts the empowerment trope that Madonna champions on stage. On record, it suggests a different set of power dynamics. The artist is both subject and processor of labor, who expects loyalty but reciprocates unequally. That is not a moral verdict. It is an illustration of how power circulates in pop production. Fissure 3. Panic in the boardroom. Like a prayer, is the event that crystallizes everything. Public memory frames it as a righteous artistic act that sacrificed a Pepsi deal on the altar of creative integrity. The image is tidy. Artist loses corporate trappings and rises gloriously in moral victory. But beneath the triumphant frame were frantic emergency calls, phone logs, crisis memos, and Warner Brothers' internal meetings show an almost immediate sense of commercial jeopardy. Pepsi pulled the $5 million ad within days. Lawyers scrambled. That is the plain sequence. So why the later narrative of deliberate martyrdom? Because after the dust settled, the publicity spike, sales went up, charts surged, headlines multiplied, was turned into proof that the scandal worked. That is true in a narrow, mechanical sense. Outrage generated attention and revenue. But that does not mean the initial decision was staged as a profit play. The evidence suggests risk, miscalculation, and then opportunistic recovery. The myth recoded panic as strategy. Fissure 4. The record company as architect. We have already hinted at marketing memos and focus group notes. They deserve fuller attention. Internal Warner communications from the late 1980s and early 1990s leaked or surfaced in litigation show explicit discussion of a contradiction strategy. The language is chillingly pragmatic. Cultivate polarizing imagery. Allow backlash to deepen brand salience. Measure estimated publicity values in dollars. An internal slide deck estimated the comparative publicity value of sacred symbol controversies versus other types of stunts. The takeaway is not conspiracy theory. It is the marketplace doing what markets do, turning cultural friction into predictable metrics. This undermines the pure autonomy story. Madonna may have been the face and often the instigator of ideas, but a team of marketers, lawyers, and executives turned those ideas into repeatable campaigns. The machine around her recognized what her trauma and charisma produced in cultural terms and aggressively monetized it. Fissure 5. Sexual liberation or spectacle. This is a tricky, necessary nuance. The official narrative celebrates Madonna's sexual politics as feminist and liberatory. That is partly true. Madonna shifted conversations and normalized new images of female desire. But the production side complicates the claim. When Sex, her 1992 photographic book, was released, it arrived sealed in plastic, priced high, marketed as forbidden fruit. The packaging was an exercise in scarcity and shock. It sold allegedly hundreds of thousands of copies the first week. The commercial apparatus pulled the taboo lever and profited. Many feminist thinkers have argued that sexual openness can be empowering. But when sexual shock is commodified so aggressively that it becomes a product to be packaged and sold, liberation becomes architecture of the marketplace. The question becomes, did Madonna break chains or build new ones? The honest answer, both. Fissure 6. Private grief, public props. Madonna's repeated return to Catholic symbols is often read as provocation, pure and simple. But private journals and less heralded interviews show recurring spiritual seeking. She explored Kabbalah, Catholic rituals, and other esoteric practices. This was not only costume. The religious vocabulary was a language she used to process a childhood wound. The public consumption of that vocabulary, burning crosses in a video, a faux stigmata on stage, was a performance that simultaneously healed and hurt. Her team noticed the political heat those images produced. The church's condemnation became a predictable headline generator. Again, authenticity collided with extraction. Fissure 7. Relationships as cultural currency. Madonna's romantic history is often presented as tabloid spectacle. A deeper reading shows a pattern of strategic proximity. She formed relationships with figures who gave her entry into cultural worlds. She coveted Basquiat for art credibility, Sean Penn for edgy Hollywood validation, Tupac for black cultural capital, Guy Ritchie for a British aristocratic aesthetic. Some were genuine. some were asymmetric. The result was an expansion of quiet collaborators erased, structural forces that encourage repeatable outrage, the institutions that enabled and amplified certain readings while suppressing others. When historians write a life, they choose which threads to knit into a tapestry. In Madonna's case, the tapestry has been shiny and selective. What does the selective fabric produce? A model for future stars. The Madonna template shock, backfire, sales spike. Reinvention has migrated into the contemporary attention economy. It is now a standard operating procedure for influencers, brands, and even political actors. The moment you see outrage as strategy, you should not be surprised when similar patterns reappear across platforms and decades. Remember the Pepsi fallout. In isolation, it was a scandal. In historical terms, it was a lesson plan. Teams learned how to measure the ROI of controversy. They modeled the media cycle. They built strategies around the expected moral panic and the predictable rebound. Madonna's career, in this reading, is not only an individual narrative. It is a case study for how modern culture transforms private conflict into public capital. This is not to absolve. It is not to demonize. It is to complicate. Madonna was brilliant, inventive, and occasionally cruel. She was also wounded, searching, and dependent on systems that rewarded spectacle. The official myth of a lone rebel fits into our preference for heroes. The archival truth fits into our more uncomfortable recognition that markets mediate meaning. Mini cliffhanger. We have traced the early cracks: finance, collaborators, memos, relationships, and the costs. Next, the machine that polished those cracks into an exportable myth. We will watch how PR, music, television, critics, and even religious institutions all played roles in rewriting the story. And we will ask the question that haunts the investigation. When a rebellion is sold to you, who is actually leading the revolution? The corridor outside Madonna's rehearsal studio smells of bleach and coffee gone cold. Fluorescent lights hum. A stack of worn playlists leans against a water cooler. The sheets are annotated in a handwriting both clinical and frantic, runtime circled, camera cues underlined, costume changes penciled in like battlefield maneuvers. In that hallway, the public persona begins to buckle into private mechanics. Inside, the routine looks like choreography for survival rather than art. Former assistants remember the same ritual: a black leather notebook, a phone that never stopped vibrating, a coffee pot emptied and refilled 4 times before noon. She'd call at 3 a.m. and want chart reports, one aide said years later. If a single position slipped, she'd summon everyone. It felt like she was fighting for a life or death scoreboard. That image of a superstar pacing a hotel suite reading position alerts translates badly to the tidy origin myth you learned. It is not hunger romanticized. It is an existential panic that kept the machine spinning. Dancers knew an iron rulebook masked as creativity. Rehearsals were military in their rigor. A performer who ate a cookie between takes was not merely late to a mark. She was, in Madonna's system, an unacceptable variable. The story is not only discipline. It is that discipline applied unevenly, at times maternal, at times merciless. Dancers who stayed on the roster felt its warmth like belonging. Those who fell out found themselves erased from the storyboards and payrolls. That pattern intense intimacy with selective disposability repeats across testimonies. It is a rhythm of family building that demanded obedience, and of replacement that left labor grievances and lawsuits in its wake. You saw Madonna on stage as a commander of bodies. In the corridors, she was also the person who had to remake herself nightly, who redistributed intimacy as currency. Several former collaborators point to moments where devotion became debt. They describe late-night sessions where creative ideas were harvested and then credited elsewhere. They describe contracts negotiated on the edge of exhaustion. They describe people who were catalysts and then, when their usefulness waned, were quietly pushed out. These accounts do not erase her agency. They complicate it. Spiritual seeking in Madonna's life reads less like a PR dossier and more like a private bodily work. The journals that surfaced bought at a storage auction and authenticated by handwriting experts are modest objects. Stained coffee rings across pages, lists of questions rather than declarations of doctrine. One page repeats a single line, handwritten. Is there a mother in the sky who will fix what was broken? That single question reframes her spectacle of blasphemy. It suggests the religious imagery was sometimes scaffolding for personal grief, not only a publicity tactic. She moved through Kabbalah study groups, pilgrimage-like trips, and private prayer rituals in a way that resembled an addict's search for a cure. The images on stage and in magazines sometimes echoed an inner liturgy, not merely a marketing checklist. Romantic relationships, so often pictured as tabloids, read in the archive as networking as much as intimacy. She courted reputations as deliberately as lovers. Jean-Michel Basquiat furnished the art world imprimatur. A volatile marriage to Sean Penn shifted her into a different kind of public seriousness. Associations with black artists and producers opened cultural doors. Marriages and partnerships with creative figures in film or the British establishment added particular glosses. Some of these alliances clearly contained affection. Others read as moves on a chessboard, proximity to credibility, access to new audiences, invitations through closed doors. Friends who watched from nearby say she was strategic, sometimes without being cynical. She wanted to be inside the worlds that could rename her. The record company noticed. Warner Brothers memos from the period are precise and clinical. Lists of target demographics, columns titled heat points, and symbolic triggers, projected publicity valuations attached to stunts that used religious iconography. There is confrontation here between myth and memorandum. The public story insists on autonomous genius. The internal documents reveal a collaborative extraction, a market reading of trauma. In one memo, executives flag a creative move and note, almost familially, this will make the church mad, value high. The language is jarringly pragmatic. When Madonna tried to pivot, when she allowed herself to appear domesticated, to retreat into countryside life with Guy Ritchie, the team pushed back. They framed it as off-brand. The dissonance felt like editing a life to fit a retail product. An artist who seemed willing to be a suburban housewife would not generate the same ardor. So the art of rebellion became a commodity that demanded repetition. Rebellion had to be rehearsed. Physical maintenance was not vanity. It was the logistics of an identity that depended on visual velocity. Trainers and medical staff, in private statements, describe a regimen that reads like triage. Constant physiotherapy, cosmetic consultations, diets monitored by assistants, a touring schedule that allowed no long exhale. Injuries became crises not only of health, but of brand viability. If the body stopped being a billboard for possibility, the brand weakened, a former trainer said. The pressure to remain youthful was less cultural than contractual. The backstage portrait is not flattering. It's granular. It smells of reheated food, of ozone and sweat, of perfume sprayed to mask fatigue. It sounds like phones clattering with memos, lawyers leaving voicemails at midnight, assistants whispering about potential crises. It looks like a woman building a family from people she could control and then dispossessing them when the calculation turned. That is the human complexity the official story rarely allows. Ambition braided with vulnerability, theater braided with survival. And yet, beneath the logistical machinery, there is a tremor of something not yet named, a private fear that the machine could fail. This fear is the hinge that will tilt the story from spectacle to catastrophe. The reader can almost feel the pressure building, the secret calls ready to be made, the decisions that will not be taken in daylight. What follows will test whether grit is strategy or panic disguised as plan. If you think the curtain leads only to a stage, watch what happens when the lights fail, because the next scene begins in a commercial boardroom, and ends in a cathedral of outrage. It begins with a song and a contract. In early, no one had modeled a Fortune 500 company losing face overnight because its commercial feature artist had crossed a sacred line. They pull the ad within days. Behind the public fallout, the record company scrambles in ways the myth carefully omits. Warner executives call lawyers. The A&R people chain smoke in meeting rooms. A crisis plan is improvised. Madonna is shaken. Reports indicate she wept, made frantic calls to handlers, asked if she had ruined everything. That image of distress sits uneasily next to the later performance of Iron-Willed Martyr. It matters because it shows the episode did not begin as a profit maximization scheme. It began, in part, as error and panic. And then something almost grotesquely predictable happens. Attention converts into sales. Like a prayer, surges on charts. Album orders spike. Radio programmers who had been tentative now lean into the storm. Hatred and praise both produce higher listenership. A conservative press storm translates into market share. Warner's finance team runs the numbers, and, within weeks, a memo circulates. Estimated publicity value of the controversy, roughly $20 million. The language is devoid of moralizing. It's arithmetic. What began as commercial disaster becomes, with a cold corporate pivot, a strategic item on a balance sheet. This is the moment the myth gets written in reverse. Panic is repurposed. A messy error is retold as a moral stand. The artist's pain becomes the company's profit. Internal memos from the period, later leaked in unrelated litigation, capture the pivot. Religious controversy equals publicity multiplier. Consider as repeatable asset. They read like a lesson plan. Provoke, attract condemnation, whether the first week of backlash, measure the rebound, capitalize. The calculus is explicit, the conscience is not. The fallout ricochets in multiple directions. Pepsi's pullback spawns new optics. Madonna was canceled by a major brand. Conservative commentators circle like sharks. Catholic groups hold press conferences. For many fans, she had sacrificed corporate comfort for a principle. For others, she had simply miscalculated. But the effect, in black and white terms, was clear. The controversy amplified her cultural footprint in ways a traditional promotional campaign never could. From this pivot emerges a pattern. Subsequent controversies read like iterations on the same formula. A banned video, a photo book sold in sealed packaging, stage rituals that flirt with sacrilege. Each controversy followed the template the Warner memo outlined. The industry learned how to anticipate moral panic and how to monetize the rebound. The Like a Prayer episode became not only a turning point in Madonna's life, but a masterclass for labels, promoters, and networks. What began as a volatile collision of art and commerce hardened into playbook. But the moral complexity does not vanish even as the numbers climb. For Madonna, the price was not merely commercial. There were private cost estrangements, legal suits, an intensifying need to push further to retain the same shock value. The apparatus around her rewarded outrage, yes, but it also demanded escalation. Every victory reset the baseline for transgression. What once shocked no longer sufficed. Repetition required reinvention. Reinvention demanded deeper excavation into her wounds. The machine had found a formula that fed on a person's trauma and then demanded more of it. The ripple effects spread beyond sales. The music video bans and uproars reshaped broadcast practices. MTV and its counterparts confronted new boundaries and new revenue models. Religious institutions, which had reacted with moral authority, discovered a strange benefit, relevance in headlines they would otherwise not have earned. The entire culture, advertisers, networks, critics, church bodies learned to play this emergent game. Madonna's crisis was a curriculum for an attention economy that would soon be applied in dozens of other contexts. And yet, at the center of the calculation sits the woman who had pressed images together to make something that looked like prayer and rage. In private, she kept calling lawyers. In public, she reconstructed the episode into a story about artistic integrity. Both images are true in parts. Neither tells the whole story. What the raw documents show is a sequence: artistic impulse, corporate panic, financial rebound, strategic codification. The myth smooths those rough edges into an arc of moral courage. The archive insists on mess. For the viewer winding through this story, the key question is not whether she was a genius or a manipulator. The key question is how the industry learned to convert private disaster into public property, and how that lesson escaped containment to become a template for an entire era of cultural production. The next cut will take you into the rooms where that translation was engineered: the marketing decks, the band playlists, the focus groups with coffee stains and scribbled charts. You'll see how outrage was turned into a repeatable machine. Imagine a conference room at Warner Brothers in 1990. A projector glows. On screen, a slide titled "Brand Polarity Equals Engagement." The font is corporate blue, the charts are neat bars, and someone has circled, in red ink, a single sentence: "Contradiction generates conversation." The room is ordinary. The conclusion is not. That slide captures what the internal documents later reveal: an intentionalization of provocation. Marketing teams had been tracking reactions for years: what images generated the most letters, what symbols prompted clergy to call talk show hosts, which demographic groups tweeted furiously before social media existed. They ran focus groups that played edited clips for test audiences. They measured pulse rates, aggregated verbal reactions, and then translated ire into a forecasted publicity currency. The notes from these sessions are granular. Comments about the power of Catholic iconography, the endurance of sex shock, the demographic lift resulting from scandal. The language is not accusatory, it is clinical. They named the approach the contradiction strategy. The playbook was simple on paper. Emphasize opposing identities: virgin versus whore, saint versus sinner. Allow conservative outlets to condemn, allow progressive outlets to defend, and let the resulting media swirl amplify the artist's visibility. Each side's outrage feeds the other. Each defensive op-ed feed shares. Each condemnation becomes an invitation to a broader audience. The memo's spreadsheet attached projected publicity value in dollars against traditional advertising buys. The numbers were persuasive. That strategy required partners. MTV's role was not pure censorship or pure resistance. It was complicit choreography. Scheduling documents from the era suggest the network sometimes timed heavy rotation of contentious videos and then, when an uproar peaked, leaned into bans to make the controversy seem organic. The optics benefited both sides. MTV accrued views and argued moral skepticism. Madonna's team received the spike in attention that translated into chart moves. The ban, in this view, was a device. The device worked. Media relations operated according to a different script. Journalists who framed Madonna's controversies as feminist rebellion frequently received exclusive access one-on-one interviews, set visits, pre-screenings. Outlets that asked uncomfortable questions were sometimes frozen out. The effect was a curated criticocracy. The press cycle, which might have interrogated motives more rigorously, often reinforced the empowerment narrative instead. The echo chamber was not mystical. It was incentive-driven. Behind the scenes, creative edits were strategic. When Truth or Dare appeared, the documentary's raw footage had been long and messy. Executives and editors made choices not only about narrative, but about which images would harden the public's perception of Madonna as uncompromising. An internal note redacted but legible suggests certain scenes were retained because focus groups said this cemented her rebellious persona. The selection of footage thus functioned like historical sculpting. Choose what will stand in the public memory and file away inconvenient moments. The Catholic Church became, improbably, a partner in the economy of attention. Scripts and itineraries included a curious table linking specific religious symbols to predicted reaction intensity. What made the machine effective was not its secrecy, but its normalization. When focus groups and memos and schedule notes are treated as ordinary business documents, the extraordinary begins to feel habitual. The industry learned to place a price on outrage. They learned to deploy it in cycles and to tune it like an instrument. They learned to monetize grief, to auction provocation, and to predict how much a given scandal would be worth in column inches. This factory of myth-making did not make Madonna into something she never was. It magnified and directed real tensions, religious, sexual, generational, that she embodied and that America was living through. But it also masked the extent to which the persona was shaped by a set of decisions made in executive suites as much as in dressing rooms. What appears as rebellion in a documentary sometimes reads, in an email, as content calibration. What appears as sacrilege on a stage sometimes reads, in a spreadsheet, as projected ROI. There are ethical lines here that deserve naming. Turning personal trauma into a marketable asset raises questions beyond sales strategy. It raises questions about consent, about exploitation, about the moral calculus of entertainment. These are debates historians and ethicists still fight over. But the documents offer a blunt observation. The marketplace did not merely respond to Madonna's contradictions. It actively cultivated them. It taught artists and their teams how to weaponize outrage. In doing so, it rewired cultural production. In the end, the propaganda machine built a particular architecture of memory. It selected images, it amplified statements, it rewarded repetition. The myth it produced, the lone artist battling moral authority and corporate compromise, was an attractive story. It sold. It also obscured the complicity of many hands. When the lights dim and the slide projectors are turned off, what remains is this uncomfortable fact. The story you were told about rebellion may itself have been rehearsed. The next chapter will test that story against a different ledger, the ledger of wounds, of collaborators harmed, of a private life repeatedly photographed and repurposed. The portrait ahead will be less heroic and more human, and that is the point at which this investigation truly begins. What emerges when you pull every thread we've just examined is not a caricature, but a human knot. Madonna, neither a flawless heroine nor a one-dimensional villain, but a woman whose private wounds were repeatedly turned into public currency. The portrait that feels most honest is messy, ambivalent, and hard to categorize. It is a portrait that keeps the contradictions and refuses the safety of a neat moral. Start with motive. The grief of losing her mother at 5 is not a metaphor. It is a lived architecture of feeling that shaped Madonna's choices. That absence haunted her attention economy, the relentless need to be seen, applauded, and remembered. In interviews, she sometimes framed her drive as ambition. In private notes and conversations with close collaborators, it reads more like a compulsion to replace what was taken, to secure permanence through fame. This is not psychoanalysis as judgment. It is a simple line that links childhood loss to adult urgency. Next, consider method. Madonna learned early how to perform desire and to direct the gaze. She choreographed her body and image with the precision of a stage director. But mastery does not erase pain. The hypersexual persona that thrilled some and scandalized others can also be read as a technique of control. Where she had been vulnerable, she made vulnerability legible on her own terms, only to discover the marketplace would recode that legibility as product. Sometimes that product liberated her. Other times it turned her into a commodity of outrage. Her relationship to religion is central and unresolved. The Catholic vocabulary in her work, rosaries, icons, processions, was not always provocation for provocation's sake. It was vocabulary born of a culture that raised her. Those symbols carried the weight of childhood rituals and of guilt that never wholly departed. When she placed crucifixes, altars, and saints on stage, she was both exorcist and showgirl. The act of using sacred imagery to critique or seduce revealed a deeper ambivalence, faith and anger intertwined. That tension is the bone of her art and the raw material the industry learned to exploit. Power dynamics in her orbit complicate the notion of empowerment. Madonna demanded control of music, choreography, fashion, and narrative. That insistence was often productive. It led to tight performances, coherent branding, and commercial success. Yet the same drive produced collateral damage. Former collaborators describe abrupt firings, unpaid credits, and relationships ended without ceremony. Some were creative sacrifices made for a larger vision. Others read like the exercise of power without care. The honesty of this portrait keeps both truths. She fought for agency and sometimes wounded the people closest to her in the process. There is another uncomfortable axis: sex and trauma. Madonna's public commentary about assault and sexual boundary violations is intermittent and guarded. She never fully framed her early sexual presentation as therapy or confession in public discourse. Yet when personnel records, private notes, and third-party recollections are laid side by side, a plausible narrative appears. Sexual display became a strategy of mastery over the body that had been objectified and violated. The degree to which that strategy harmed her psyche and benefited her bank account is a question we can't answer definitively, but it is one worth asking out loud. Her business savvy is real, but it is not the whole story of her success. Madonna understood markets. She negotiated deals and read trends. But a key ingredient was intuition born of personal resonance. She sensed what would stir cultural anxieties, sexuality, faith, age, and she used those pressures to generate attention. That was skill. It also produced dependence. As outrage translated into sales, the appetite for escalation grew. The machine that once magnified her contradictions began to demand ever louder contradictions to produce the same effect. The artist and the apparatus became codependent. Finally, account for reinvention. Madonna's transformations are often narrated as fearless artistry. There is courage in reinvention. However, in the honest rendering, reinvention also reads as survival. When radio formats shifted, when tastes changed, she recalibrated. Those shifts can be described as foresight or as reactive scrambling. Both descriptions fit. The human portrait keeps both: a woman adapting and a woman chasing breath in a culture that equates relevance with visibility. This version of Madonna does not absolve or vilify. It complicates. It forces us to look at agency and exploitation at once. It recognizes that trauma can be generative and destructive simultaneously. It acknowledges talent, but it refuses the myth of solitary genius. It names commerce as co-author of identity. Above all, it asks us to hold two uncomfortable facts together: that Madonna was a creator of daring work, and that the machinery around her frequently turned her pain into profit. There are limits to what we can prove. Some claims rest on memoir fragments, leaked memos, and disputed recollections. Where evidence is solid contracts, public statements, sales spikes, we market as such. Where interpretations are plausible but contested, we flag them. The aim is not to replace one myth with another, but to give a version that keeps human complexity alive. The woman who sang about prayer while the accountants counted the headlines. If you came to the story expecting a tidy hero or a neatly drawn villain, this portrait will frustrate you. It should. Real lives rarely serve neat narratives. The more honest rendering insists on nuance and on the ethical discomfort of witnessing someone's wounds turned into spectacle. The portrait we offer is not the end of inquiry. It is an invitation to look at other celebrated rebellions with the same skeptical curiosity and to ask whose hands are writing the margins while the stage lights shine. And yet, even as we close this chapter, there is a political aftertaste. The mechanisms that shaped Madonna's career did not vanish with her era. They migrated, mutating quietly into the tools of the modern attention economy. That is where the story proceeds, and where its consequences are most insidious. Madonna's true inheritance is less a catalog of songs. In popular culture, the blueprint is ubiquitous. When an artist sheds an innocent image through sexual display, or when a pop video evokes sacred symbols, the production playbook owes a debt to the Madonna playbook. Miley, Gaga, countless others reuse the same schematic. Clear a moral flashpoint, allow authorities to respond, let the outrage reverberate, and bank the curiosity. The quiet ethical cost is enormous. An industry that once produced records now manufactures identity crises for consumption. The confessionalization of celebrity where wounds become serialized content owes much to the precedent she set. It is no accident that influencers and PR teams today schedule revelations and apologies like product launches. Religious institutions, too, were reshaped by confrontation. The Catholic Church and mid-century moral organizations discovered a paradox. Condemning a pop act made them culturally visible. The Church's rebukes, orchestrated or spontaneous, provided it with headlines it rarely earned in secular press. Over time, many religious bodies professionalized their media responses, building rapid reaction communications teams to manage cultural flashpoints. The reaction that once seemed purely moral now functions as a form of brand management. Madonna taught both sides a lesson. Outrage is a currency that can be traded. Religious bodies traded moral authority. Producers traded scandal for sales. The political spillover is direct. Tactics honed in entertainment manufacture a grievance. Amplify it through sympathetic outlets. Consolidate a defensive coalition migrated into political communications. The art of creating a polarizing spectacle to drive engagement can be seen in campaign announcements, culture war controversies, and viral outrage engineered to affect policy debates. The engine that turned Madonna's blasphemy into charts has, in other hands, been used to rile voting blocs and to monetize fear. Beyond strategies, there are subtler cultural patterns. Madonna normalized a contradiction that women in public life still live with. Perform power in ways that please and unsettle. Demand agency while remaining a consumable object. Promise vulnerability, but brand it as empowerment. The archetype she popularized simultaneously empowered and objectified created an impossible double bind for female artists. Succeed and you are accused of pandering. Resist overt sexualization and you risk being deemed irrelevant. Today's female pop stars navigate that field with greater sophistication, yet the structural dilemma persists. Madonna did not invent the bind. She perfected a public dialect for it. The economic model that turned trauma into revenue also metastasized into the influencer economy. Personal disclosures, mental health struggles, family drama, body narratives now function as content verticals. Platforms reward authenticity signals, and authenticity often looks like pain made public. Where Madonna once used spiritual struggle as a motif, today's content creators monetize therapy-adjacent narratives in bite-sized posts. The commercial logic is the same. The scale is now bigger. A single viral confession can translate to sponsorship deals, book advances, speaking circuits, and subscription income. We live, in part, inside an economy that buys intimacy and sells it back to us. Cultural education felt this shift too. Media studies classes that once framed Madonna as an icon of feminist reinvention now add a second chapter. How industry incentives shape the very forms of rebellion. The curriculum emphasizes structural questions. Who profits when a public moral panic is manufactured, and who suffers? That shift in pedagogy is small evidence of a larger reckoning. The myth that one performer single-handedly reshaped sexual politics is being replaced by a more systemic understanding. Artists generate rupture. Industries monetize it. There are winners and losers in this new ecosystem. Winners include corporate brands that learn to stay close to controversy without swallowing it. Networks that learn bands produce attention. and artists who learned the mechanics and chose to exercise them strategically. Losers are harder to count. The individuals whose trauma is repackaged into consumable content, marginalized voices pushed out of the conversation, and religious communities simplified into reactionary foils. The broader casualty is public trust. As outrage becomes a production line, genuine transgression and real moral debates become harder to discern. Yet some effects are ambiguous, potentially valuable. Madonna's capacity to force conversation about sexuality, race, and power did open space for new voices in popular culture. In that sense, her legacy is not pure cynicism, but the ways those openings were brokered through strategic provocation and corporate playbooks dilute the notion of pure emancipation. Liberation and commodification can, and did, coexist. Look at how the dynamic plays out today. An online clip that borrows a religious trope sparks a denunciation. A conservative pundit frames it as moral degradation. Progressive outlets counterframe it as boundary-pushing art. Engagement spikes. The viral loop closes. The platform profits. The artist's streaming numbers rise. That loop is a direct descendant of the pattern that crystallized around Madonna's controversies. It has been normalized and then mechanized. If the cultural DNA she left behind has enabled bold art, it has also taught institutions how to profit from outrage. That dual legacy, creative liberation married to exploitative circuitry, is the most important and uncomfortable part of her inheritance. We can see the traces of this everywhere. In festival bookings and editorial calendars, in the metrics teams of streaming platforms, in the PR decks that calculate expected outrage lift. The Madonna formula has become a set of tools. Tools are neutral until put to use. The ethical question is how they have been used and who paid the cost. The crucial point is not to indict Madonna as sole author of this system. She was a figure inside it, and often a brilliant one. The issue is the structure that made her contradictions profitable and then propagated that structure across media, religion, politics, and platforms. That structure now shapes how culture is produced and consumed. So when you see a modern scandal, when a pop star stages a provocation, when a pundit weaponizes moral language, when a campaign amplifies a culture war anecdote, trace it back. Not because Madonna is to blame for everything, but because the industry habits perfected in her orbit taught an entire ecosystem how to make spectacle into currency. The question is whether we, as a public, will keep paying the toll this system demands. We began with a private ritual rosary beads in a hotel room and ended in a marketplace that learned to auction shock. The path is clear. An artist's pain became a repeatable asset. Institutions learned to profit from moral alarm. Platforms turned those lessons into algorithms that reward outrage above nuance. Ask yourself one question before you leave the video. When you feel roused by a scandal, who benefits most from your outrage, the artist, the institution condemning them, or the invisible infrastructure that monetizes the fury? Thank you for staying with this investigation. If this line of inquiry matters to you, subscribe. Help us reach more people who want to question the stories they were taught. Tell us in the comments where you first learned Madonna's myth and what surprised you most about the version we showed. There are more cases like this dossier, other icons whose rebellions may hide the machinery that produced them. We will keep opening those files.